There are so many insights into the very nature of God since the resurrection. And that one of the things that is so important is that God will never fail us. It's the point of St. Peter's exhortation from the book of Acts. He's explaining how Christ's resurrection was the fulfillment of all that was in the Old Testament, all those promises, that now Jesus has fulfilled them, and he will always be with his people. And today's psalm does that same theme when David writes, I set the Lord before me, with him at my right, and I shall not be disturbed. You know, the sitting on the right side, the right hand of the king was always the honored spot. And that's where, God is for us. And we are there for him. He is our God, and we are on his right. It's so always kind of be thinking about that. And why can't it be on the left? Well, because in those days, that was the image that was being made for them. And in the second reading, again from Peter and all that's happening there, because he is still our very first pope. And he says that, our Redeemer is not perishable, not shaky, not undependable, but solid, strong, and the worthy foundation for our own faith and how we live. And in the gospel, we see this again in a very dramatic way with the two disciples walking down to Emmaus. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about that. They're going away from Jerusalem. In Luke's gospel, it's kind of so often it's going up to Jerusalem. But now, here are these two guys, they're walking the wrong way. They're walking away from Jesus. They were talking about what they had seen and heard, but something was different when they're walking away from the site of the action. And here comes Jesus, and even though they're walking on the wrong way, he joins them. And he says, I am here. And he begins through the redoing of the scriptures of all these things that pointed to Jesus. And gradually, he wasn't shouting at them, he wasn't shaking his finger at them, but knowing and going through all those prophecies, he came to say, were not our hearts burning when he told us about himself in the scriptures? So that beautiful entry there. So it's a good thing for us, too, when we are evangelizing, is to kind of take that kind of same tact that Jesus took. And not beat somebody over the head, well, you got to do this, you got to do that. Rather than that, just walk with them. Walk with them on their journey, even if they're walking the wrong way. Walk with them. Ask questions of them. They say, well, I believe, and say, I believe whatever, X. And say, well, what does that mean for you? Just ask them questions like that. You don't have to say you're wrong, but you begin to draw them in to that story of Christ. Now, almost everybody in the world today, if you said, what was Jesus? What happened to Jesus? Most people, the vast majority of people, would say, well, he was in Jerusalem and said he was the Son of God, and he was crucified, and Some people thought he rose from the dead. They know the data. Most people know the data, but they don't have the key to understanding the data. They don't know what the data means. So it's not just knowing data. Computers know a lot of data, but they don't know what it means. Only we can come up with that. And that's what happened with Jesus walking with these two disciples. They began to see the pattern. It wasn't just something over here, something over there. It's a whole sweep of all our scriptures, from the very beginning to the very end of our scriptures, that God has come to us, and God is with us, and he never abandons us. And as I was looking at today's readings, what came to mind is that absolutely gorgeous poem by Francis Thompson, and it begins, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled from him down the labyrinthian ways of my mind, and in the midst of tears, I hid from him. How often are we like that? We're running away from the hound of heaven. You might take some time this week just to go on the internet and read that beautiful poem by Thompson, The Hound of Heaven. God never abandons us, never. He's always coming to us and working with us. That's how we evangelize. We do not give up on people. I knew one woman whose children had stopped going to church. So she made a little Marian shrine right inside the front door, a little shelf there. And whenever anybody came, she would light a candle and ask the people to pray for her son who had stopped going to church, etc. Well, after a few months, he came for a visit to his mom, and he said, when did you put that little candle up there? What do you do? He said, well, hon, I know you stopped going to church, but anytime anybody comes in, I ask them to pray for you to get back to church. He got embarrassed and started going back to church again. Moms, you got power. And so do dads. Never give up on people. Walk with them. Ask them questions. And then, we'll find something with common ground. And then you start maybe doing a little teaching. Thomas Merton, in his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, he was a communist, probably at least an agnostic. He might have been an atheist at that time, but surely an agnostic. And he was living with the Privet family in France. And he would just say, well, God is God. There's no big difference. And all these kinds of things that we hear. And they would just look at him and say, impossible. Impossible. It's impossible for us to think like that. And he wrote in his autobiography that every time they would say that, he would get a little more convicted, thinking, what do they have that I don't? What is in their hearts? And finally, they began to talk a little more. We have to be like that. So when our family members say, well, God is God. It doesn't make any difference what church you go to. Just say, impossible. It's impossible for me to believe. Gradually, not making any big judgments, but they will begin to know that Jesus walks with them. And when they realize that Jesus walks with them, they will begin to ask the questions. And then we can explain to them the many prophecies to help their hearts burn with the fire and the truth of Scripture. And then maybe bring them back home, or bring them into the home of our church. And that's what the disciples did. When they saw the breaking of the bread, they went back to the church. They went back to Jerusalem. That's what we have to do as well, to bring, with the grace of God, a loving truth that he is always with us here in the church.